They said the West belonged to the bandits, until one day it didn't. The land stretched wide beneath the merciless sun, a place of rolling sagebrush and red canyons carved deep into the bones of the earth. Dust clung to the air like a curse, coating the faces of the settlers who moved about with lowered eyes and heavy steps. Wooden towns rose like brittle skeletons from the desert floor. Their saloons and storefronts bowed beneath the weight of fear. Every nail driven, every board hammered seemed to echo the dominance of men who carried pistols at their sides and cruelty in their eyes. The West was not free, it was ruled. The gang had no name that the locals dared to speak aloud, for their deeds carried sharper edges than any title could hold. They rode into town at dusk, black silhouettes against the burning horizon, and the sound of their hooves was enough to drain color from every cheek. At their head was a man cloaked in shadow, his name whispered only behind locked doors, Elias Crow. He was no mere outlaw. He was a tyrant with spurs and a revolver. Tall, gaunt, his eyes the color of ash, he wore a smile that promised death with as much ease as breath. It was said he had burned a sheriff alive in his own jailhouse and laughed while the flames devoured wood and bone alike. Under his hand, the saloons became dens of debauchery. The markets shrank under the weight of extortion, and every coin in every pocket bore his claim. Families packed their wagons and fled into the wilderness, while those who stayed learned to bow low, to hand over bread, grain, daughters, or silence. The church bell rarely rang anymore. It had been shot through one drunken night by one of Crow's men, the bullet leaving a jagged hole that whistled when the wind pushed through. Children grew up with fear in their marrow, their play muted, their laughter scarce. No law rode in to save them. No sheriff raised his badge. The law itself had been bought, broken, or buried. And yet, among all those bowed heads, there remained one figure who did not bend so easily. At the far edge of town, beyond a field of withered corn and a fence half fallen, stood a widow's cabin. Sarah Calder was her name. She had been left alone 2 winters past when her husband failed to return from a cattle drive. His body later found by a riverbank with Crow's mark carved into his chest. The town whispered about her, how she still lit a lamp each night, how she walked with her chin high though her dress was faded and her hands calloused. She was no gunslinger, no warrior, just a woman with grief settled deep in her bones. And yet there was a steadiness to her gaze that unsettled those who looked too long, as if sorrow had burned away fear and left only iron in its place. Crow's men had visited her once, testing her resolve. They took her last mule and laughed at the sight of her, standing there with nothing but a lantern in her hand. She had not begged nor cursed them. She had simply stared until they rode off, muttering about the widow's madness. They did not return that night, though others said they would soon. She was marked, same as every soul who refused to bow. Sarah had lost more than her husband. She had lost her crops, her savings, the rhythm of her days. Yet loss did not hollow her, it sharpened her. Every creak of saddle leather beyond her fence, every drunken shout in town, every distant gunshot carved deeper the promise she whispered to herself at night, that Crow's rule would end, and she would be there to see the dust settle on his grave. The townsfolk did not see her strength. They saw only a woman too stubborn to leave, too proud to cry. Children whispered that she walked with ghosts, that her husband's spirit still lingered in the fields. Some men scoffed at her, others pitied her, but none dared to stand with her. They believed resistance was suicide. Crow's gang numbered near 20, each man meaner than the last, their laughter sharp as the crack of a whip. To challenge them was to embrace death. And yet, in the quiet corners of the saloon, in the hush that fell when a whiskey glass clinked too loud, whispers began to form, whispers of the widow who did not bow. There were others, too, who carried the weight of Crow's cruelty in their hearts. A blacksmith whose brother had been beaten to death for failing to pay tribute. A trapper who had lost his land when Crow's men set fire to the pines. A barkeep who lived in shame for pouring drinks for the very men who had killed his son. They looked to Sarah not with hope, not yet, but with a hunger they did not name. Hunger for change, for something to break the choke hold around their necks. Crow himself paid her no mind. To him, she was less than nothing. Power lay in pistols, in gold, and fear. A lone widow had none of these. But even a shadow cannot see the spark before it strikes flame. On the night the whispers grew loudest, the town huddled indoors while the gang celebrated in the saloon. Laughter and gunfire split the air. Glass shattered, and music rose wild and cruel. Inside her cabin, Sarah sat by the lamp, her husband's rifle laid across her knees. The metal was worn, the stock scarred, but her hands rested on it as though it were alive. She had not yet fired it since his death, but the weight of it was familiar, steady, like the embrace she had once known. Her eyes lingered on the horizon, where the town lights glimmered faint through the dark. Every sound carried on the wind, the jeers, the breaking of bottles, the helpless silence of those who lived under Crow's thumb. She could feel the town's despair pressing against her door like a storm threatening to break through. She thought of her husband's grave beneath the crooked oak, of the vows spoken over his body, not in church but in the silence of her heart, that his death would not be in vain. She thought of the children who no longer laughed, of the bell that no longer rang, of the soil that no longer yielded corn. The weight of the West itself seemed to settle on her shoulders, and yet she did not falter. Beyond the cabin walls, the night deepened. Horses stamped in the distance. A coyote's cry split the air, eerie and sharp. Somewhere in the saloon, Elias Crow's voice boomed like thunder, promising ruin to anyone who dared defy him. But in the silence between those shouts, a new sound stirred. A murmur, a whisper, fragile but unyielding. Resistance was being born in the cracks of fear. Sarah rose and placed the rifle back above the hearth, her hands lingering on the barrel as though sealing a pact. She drew her shawl tight against her shoulders and blew out the lamp, leaving only the stars to witness her resolve. The town might not yet see her as more than a widow, but time would tell. The land was in chains, yes, but chains could be broken, and whispers could grow into thunder. And in the hush before dawn, when the wind carried both dust and rumor across the desert, the West held its breath. Justice had not yet come, but it was stirring, silent, unseen, waiting for its moment to step out of the shadows and meet the bandits face to face. The days blurred together in a haze of dust, smoke, and fear. Morning brought no promise of peace, only the certainty of Crow's men riding down the main street with pistols loose at their sides. They collected coin from the merchants, took livestock from the ranchers, and lifted whiskey from the barkeep without ever paying a cent. No man dared to look them in the eye. To glance too long was to invite a beating, or worse. The town had learned to live small, to move quietly, to hope that survival lay in silence. The saloon had become the throne of their rule. By noon, the gang crowded its tables, boots on wood, cards spread in dirty hands, laughter sharp as broken glass. They drank until their voices rose above the piano, and when they tired of gambling, they turned to tormenting whoever crossed their path. Once it had been a schoolteacher dragged by the hair into the street and mocked until she wept. Another time it was a young man caught smiling at a rancher's daughter. He had smiled, and for that he was whipped until his back split open. Crow himself rarely bothered with such displays. His lieutenants did the work, eager to prove their cruelty. When Crow entered, silence fell, as if even laughter feared his gaze. Ranches on the edge of town burned at night, orange flames clawing at the stars, while families fled barefoot into the sage. The smoke carried the scent of ruin for miles, and the glow lingered in the settlers' dreams. It was a way of life under Crow. What you built could be taken. What you loved could be destroyed. Men whispered of leaving, but the desert was harsher than the gang, and so they stayed, rooted in despair. Sarah Calder watched it all with eyes that never flinched. She walked through town with her basket for flour, her shawl pulled close against the grit, and though the gang shouted lewd remarks, she did not quicken her step. Once, when a drunk outlaw lurched into her path, she did not move aside. She stood until he staggered back, muttering that she had the devil's stare. People noticed, though none dared speak of it openly. They called her foolish in public, yet in private they told the tale again and again. Her first true defiance came on an afternoon when the sun hung like a burning coin over the horizon. A child darted from an alley, a boy no older than 8, his clothes ragged, his face hollow with hunger. He had stolen a loaf of bread from the mercantile, and 2 of Crow's men caught him by the collar. One laughed as he dangled the boy in the air, promising to teach the brat a lesson. They dragged him toward the trough outside the saloon, intent on holding his head beneath the water until he kicked no more. Sarah stepped forward. No one else moved. Merchants froze behind their counters. Men at the saloon doorway turned their faces away. Mothers pulled their children back into their skirts. Only Sarah's voice cut through the air, steady and sharp as a whip. Let him go. The outlaws turned, their laughter thick with disbelief. The boy dangled between them, kicking, choking on tears. One spat into the dirt. What's it to you, widow? She didn't answer. She simply moved closer, her hand resting on the strap of her basket, her eyes locked on the men as though she saw not ruffians, but wild dogs, dangerous yet predictable. Her silence unnerved them. The one holding the boy finally shoved him into the dirt, more from irritation than mercy. You're lucky she spoke, he growled, kicking dust into the child's face. The boy scrambled away, disappearing into the alleys. Sarah bent to retrieve her basket, calm as though nothing had happened, and walked on. But the moment did not vanish with her steps. The gang had noticed. By evening, word spread through the saloon. The widow had interfered. The men laughed it off, yet behind their eyes was a flicker of resentment. Defiance, no matter how small, had a way of growing if left unchecked. Crow's lieutenants reported it to him as he sat in the back booth, shadows cloaking his face. He said nothing at first, only tapped his fingers on the wood. Then he smiled, a slow curl of lips that promised trouble. A spark, he said softly, and sparks spread. That night Sarah lay awake, listening to the coyotes cry beyond the cornfield. The boy's eyes haunted her, wide with terror, hollow with hunger. She wondered what had become of him, whether he had family, whether he still breathed. The memory stirred grief she had buried deep, her husband's body by the riverbank, the mark carved into his flesh, her own hands trembling as she covered his grave. The ache pressed on her chest until it felt she might break. Yet beneath the pain burned something fiercer, the conviction that justice could not remain a dream forever. The following days brought whispers. Some townsfolk quietly admired her courage, though they spoke in shadows and closed rooms. Others cursed her recklessness, saying she would bring Crow's wrath down on them all. The blacksmith shook his head when she passed, muttering, "You'll get us all killed." The barkeep, pouring drinks for the very men who terrorized him, warned her with downcast eyes. Crow remembers every slight. Even the preacher, his voice trembling from the pulpit, urged his flock to choose peace, though everyone knew peace was only another word for surrender. Still, Sarah's defiance gnawed at the gang. They cornered her one afternoon as she returned from town, for riders circling her path. Their leader, a scar-faced brute named Lyle, spat tobacco near her feet. "Crow don't like troublemakers," he said, grinning wide enough to show missing teeth. "Maybe you ought to learn your place." Sarah did not flinch. Her hand rested lightly on the strap of her basket, and she met his stare. "I know my place," she answered. "Do you?" The men roared with laughter, though it rang hollow in the empty air. They rode off without touching her, yet the message was clear. She had drawn their eye. She was no longer invisible. In the nights that followed, fear crept into her bones like cold. She checked the windows twice, barred the door, and kept her husband's rifle near the hearth. Memory surfaced unbidden, the night he had left, promising to return with coin enough to see them through winter. The dawn she had found him cold, broken by a river that carried away his last breath. She had been powerless then. She refused to be powerless now. The town simmered with tension. Some whispered of standing with her. Others hissed that she would doom them all. The boy she had saved appeared at her door once, shy and trembling, to leave a handful of berries on her step before running away. That small offering weighed heavier than any coin. It was proof that even the weakest could find gratitude. Even the broken could believe in something more. And then the unforgivable act came. It began with fire. One night the ranch of the blacksmith's kin went up in flames, the sky bleeding red as the wind carried sparks across the fields. The family barely escaped, their home reduced to ash before dawn. But fire was not enough. The gang dragged the blacksmith himself into the street the next morning, forcing the town to gather. Crow appeared then, stepping from the saloon like a king surveying his kingdom. His eyes were calm, his voice quiet. He accused the blacksmith of hoarding coin, of plotting rebellion. Lies, but no one dared speak against him. The desert did not forgive weakness, and neither did Sarah. In the weeks after the blacksmith's death, she vanished from the town more often than not, her cabin lightless through the long nights. Rumors swirled. Some said she had lost her mind. Others claimed she was praying for salvation. But those who wandered the hills knew the truth. They heard the sharp crack of a rifle echoing through the canyons, a sound that did not belong to Crow's men. At dawn she would ride out alone, her husband's rifle tied across her back, the sun breaking over the jagged horizon. The canyons became her sanctuary, red cliffs rising high like cathedral walls, shadows stretching long over the sand. She practiced until her shoulder bruised, firing at rocks, at pine knots, at tin cans balanced on fence posts. Each shot grew cleaner, quicker. She studied the wind, the way it carried sound, the way it bent a bullet's path. In silence, she learned the rhythm of survival. Breathe steady, aim true, strike fast. But her training was not all with the rifle. She walked barefoot through dry creek beds, learning to read tracks the way her father once had. Deer hooves light as whispers, coyote prints sharp and narrow, the heavy tread of a horse carrying more than its own weight. She followed broken branches, scattered stones, trails left by careless riders. Crow's men had grown arrogant, never thinking anyone would dare track them. She knew their paths, their camps, their drinking holes. Knowledge, she told herself, was a weapon sharper than any blade. The desert gave her more than skill, it gave her clarity. The air smelled of dust and mesquite, sharp with the memory of fire. Each gust of wind carried echoes of hooves, like ghosts of those who had ridden before. Sarah felt them watching, men who had died under Crow's reign, families scattered to the wind. She was not alone. The land itself seemed to rise with her, whispering that justice might yet take root in its scorched soil. Her chance came one evening as the sun bled crimson across the sky. Sarah had tracked a pair of riders into a narrow canyon, their laughter carrying on the wind. They had raided a farm the night before, dragging off livestock and leaving a boy beaten in the dirt. Now they rode careless, their saddlebags heavy with stolen goods. Sarah crouched high above on a ridge, the rifle cool in her hands. The canyon funneled their voices upward. One of them, a broad man with a scar splitting his chin, bragged about the boy's screams. The other laughed, spitting into the sand. Sarah's finger curled around the trigger, her breath steady. She could end them both with 2 shots. But she waited. Killing from the ridge would be swift, clean, but it would not send the message the town needed. No, she had to step into the light. She slid down the rock face, boots striking sand with a quiet thud. When she stepped into the canyon floor, the men reined their horses, surprise flashing in their eyes. A lone woman stood before them, shawl drawn tight, rifle at her side. "Well now," the scarred man sneered. "Looks like the widow's wandered off her porch." Sarah lifted the rifle, the barrel steady though her heart hammered like a war drum. "Leave what you stole," she said, her voice calm, "and ride." For a moment they stared, then laughter broke loose, echoing off the canyon walls. One dismounted, swaggering toward her. "And if we don't?" he taunted. The report of the rifle split the air. Sand leapt at his boots, the bullet burying itself inches from his toes. He froze, eyes wide, the laughter dying on his lips. The other outlaw's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Sarah shifted her aim before he drew. The barrel locked on his chest. "Try," she said softly. Silence stretched thin. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. The men exchanged a glance, then spat curses, and dropped the saddlebags. With sharp kicks of their heels, they rode off, dust trailing behind them like smoke. Sarah bent to collect the stolen goods, her hands trembling only after the hoofbeats faded. She had not killed them, not yet, but word would spread. The widow had stood against Crow's men, and they had retreated. By morning the town was alive with whispers. Some called her mad, others reckless, but many felt something stir they had not known in years, hope. The boy whose farm had been raided brought her a carved wooden charm as thanks, his small hands shaking as he pressed it into hers. Old men lifted their eyes when she passed, and the barkeep poured her a drink without asking for coin. Even those too afraid to speak aloud carried the story in their eyes. A spark had become flame. Crow's men did not take it lightly. Days later, they struck back. A merchant who had once traded with Sarah found his shop ransacked, goods scattered and glass shattered. A trapper who had spoken kindly of her was found beaten outside town, his jaw broken. The gang wanted blood, but more than that, they wanted fear. They wanted to remind the town that resistance came with a price. Still, Sarah did not retreat. Each night, she rode farther into the desert, practicing until the stars wheeled overhead. She set targets in the moonlight, firing until her bullets struck true in darkness as well as day. She trained her horse to move at her signal, to duck low when she dropped from the saddle, to race hard through the canyons when the moment came. Every hour brought her closer to the reckoning she knew was coming. The reckoning came sooner than she expected. It was dusk when 4 riders cornered her on the outskirts of town. They blocked her path, revolvers gleaming in the fading light. One called out, "Crow says you've got a big mouth, widow. Time to shut it." Her pulse thundered, but she did not falter. She slid from the saddle, rifle steady in her hands. The standoff stretched long, the desert wind whistling low, carrying the scent of gunpowder as if it already knew what was coming. The first outlaw drew, quick and sure. Sarah fired faster. The crack echoed, and he crumpled into the dust, his gun still smoking in his grip. The others hesitated, caught between fear and rage. Shots rang out in a blur, sparks flashing in the twilight. Sarah dove behind a fallen log, bullets whistling overhead, splinters biting her skin. She returned fire, measured and precise, dropping another horseman with a single shot to the chest. The remaining 2 fled, cursing, their horses kicking up a storm of sand. Sarah stood, chest heaving, rifle warm in her grip. Her arm ached, her breath burned, but she was alive. Alive and victorious. By the time she returned to town, the story had outrun her. Children whispered of the duel, men slapped each other on the back, and women whispered prayers of thanks. They saw now not just a widow, but a warrior. Some even dared to believe the tide might turn. But Crow did not believe in tides. He believed in storms. That night he strode into the saloon, his shadow stretching across the floor, his men silent around him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, lifted it high, and spoke so all could hear. "The widow thinks she's fire," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "But fire burns out." He drank, slammed the glass down, and let his gaze sweep the room. "Before the sun rises, I'll put her in the ground myself, and I'll make the whole town watch." No one spoke. No one breathed. The desert beyond the saloon doors lay quiet, but in that stillness the west seemed to tremble, as if it too knew that by dawn, blood would soak its sands. The night before the storm, the town slept fitfully. Doors were barred, lamps burned low, and every creak of the wind set hearts racing. Yet in Sarah Calder's cabin, no sleep came at all. She sat by the hearth with her husband's rifle across her lap, staring into the embers as though they held the faces of the dead. Memories rose like smoke. Her father teaching her to steady her aim at tin cans in the orchard, her husband laughing as she outshot him at 20 paces, the day she buried him with dirt sticking to her hands. She had not spoken of her past to anyone, not even when whispers of her skill began to spread. But the truth was simple. She had been raised with a gun in her hands, taught to hunt by a man who believed his daughter should never be helpless in a land where wolves wore spurs and carried pistols. What had seemed like an oddity then had become her salvation now. And her grief, the raw wound left by her husband's death, had become the fire that kept her standing when others bowed. The town gathered in secret that same night, in the church with its broken bell. Faces lined the pews, drawn and fearful, yet something stirred in them, a trembling spark that had not burned in years. Farmers clutching old muskets, trappers with long knives strapped to their belts, women with pistols that had gathered dust since their fathers carried them. They did not come because they believed they would live. They came because they could no longer stomach dying on their knees. Sarah stood before them, not as a preacher, not as a general, but as one of their own. "Crow will ride at dawn," she told them, her voice carrying through the rafters. "He means to break me. But make no mistake, if I fall, you fall with me. If I stand, then maybe, just maybe, the West will belong to us again." There was silence, then a single nod from the blacksmith's widow, her face streaked with soot and tears. One by one, others followed. Old men, young mothers, boys barely old enough to shave. They had little, but what they had they would give. When the meeting ended, they moved through the streets like shadows, stacking barrels, boarding windows, laying what meager traps they could. It was not much, but it was defiance, and defiance carried weight. Dawn came blood-red, the sky painted in fire. Hooves thundered before the sun fully crested, a wall of dust rising on the horizon. Crow's gang rode in force, 20 strong, faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. Their horses snorted and pawed at the ground, manes slick with sweat, iron-shod hooves striking sparks against stone. At their head was Elias Crow, tall and gaunt as ever, his black coat flaring behind him like wings of shadow. He reined in at the edge of town, his pale eye sweeping the buildings, the boarded windows, the barrels stacked in defiance. Then he laughed, a sound as sharp as a blade scraping stone. "Fools," he called, his voice carrying across the square. "Do you think you can stand against me? I own this land. I own your lives. And before this day ends, I'll own your graves." The answer came not in words, but in a rifle shot. From the rooftop of the mercantile, a trapper pulled the trigger, and one of Crow's men fell backward from his saddle, blood blooming across his chest. The town erupted. Gunfire cracked like thunder. Bullets whined through the air. Windows shattered in a spray of glass. The farmers fired from doorways, the women from behind barrels, the children huddled with powder and ball to reload what weapons they could. Chaos consumed the street. Horses screaming, men shouting, the acrid stench of gunpowder rolling thick as smoke. Sarah moved through it like a storm given flesh. Her rifle barked again and again, each shot precise, measured, deadly. She dropped a rider who had drawn on the preacher, then turned and fired on another who had set flame to the blacksmith's shop. She reloaded with hands steady as stone, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her eyes alight with a fury that made even Crow's men hesitate. But the cost was terrible. The barkeep fell with a bullet in his throat, his last breath spilling over the bar he had tended for 20 years. A trapper took a shot meant for his son, collapsing into the dirt with his knife still clutched in his hand. The preacher, voice hoarse from shouting prayers, staggered forward with a pistol and bought one last moment of hope before he, too, was cut down. Their sacrifices struck deep into the townsfolk's hearts, fueling their rage, stiffening their spines. The street became a battlefield of smoke and flame. Horses reared and bolted, wagons splintered, and the saloon itself caught fire, flames licking skyward as if to bear witness. Still the townsfolk fought, driven by something stronger than fear. And through it all, Crow remained, moving with cold precision, his revolver spitting death as he cut a path toward Sarah. Their eyes met across the chaos, and in that instant, silence seemed to fall. Around them the battle raged, but for Sarah and Crow, there was only the space between, the weight of years and grief and vengeance pressing down. She knew then why he unnerved her so, why his presence had haunted her more than any other man. He was the face in her nightmares, the mark carved into her husband's flesh. He had killed not just her love but her life, and now he came to finish what he had begun. They faced each other in the center of the square, the dust swirling around their boots, the flames painting the sky behind them. Crow smiled, thin and cruel. "So it's you," he said, the widow with fire in her eyes. "I should have put you in the ground with your man." Sarah lifted her rifle, her breath steady despite the pounding of her heart. "You'll join him soon enough." The street grew still. Men held their fire. Horses snorted nervously. The crackle of flames filled the silence. It was as if the world itself leaned in to watch. Crow's hand hovered near his revolver, fingers twitching. Sarah's grip tightened on the rifle stock, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. The space between them stretched thin as glass, ready to shatter. Every eye in the town, every soul, hung suspended in that heartbeat before destiny struck. The smoke hung low over the town, drifting in lazy, ghostly tendrils that curled around shattered windows and blackened beams. Ash lay thick on the ground, soft as snow beneath the boots of the weary. Horses whinnied in the distance, riderless, their reins trailing in the dust. The saloon smoldered, flames reduced now to a red glow, its doors gone, its walls leaning like a drunkard about to collapse. In the silence after the storm, every sound carried a cough, the rattle of glass, the sob of a child who had not cried until the shooting stopped. The West, for the first time in years, was quiet. No jeering laughter, no cruel commands barked from horseback, no threat lingering in every shadow. Only the town, broken but breathing, standing in the ruins of what it had endured. For the first time in so long, the people lifted their eyes without flinching. Sarah stood in the center of the square, her rifle lowered, her body trembling with exhaustion. Blood streaked her sleeve where a bullet had grazed her arm, her face streaked with soot and sweat. Around her lay the fallen, both friend and foe, men who had given their lives to buy freedom, and those who had squandered theirs in cruelty. The ground itself seemed stained with memory, each pool of blood a testament to what it had cost to break the chains. She had faced Elias Crow in the dust, and when the silence shattered with gunfire, it was not his weapon that sang true. He lay now sprawled in the dirt, his revolver inches from his hand, his lifeless eyes staring at a sky that would no longer bend to his will. The tyrant who had ruled with fire and fear was gone. The chains were broken. The townsfolk emerged slowly from their hiding places, blinking against the dawn. They moved like men and women waking from a long nightmare, each step tentative, unbelieving. A farmer dropped his rusted musket and sank to his knees, his shoulders shaking. A mother clutched her son tight against her chest, pressing his face into her skirts as though to shield him from the sight of death. The preacher's widow lit a lantern and placed it on the gallows beam, the flame dancing gently in the new day's light. Sarah's gaze swept them all, the rifle still clutched in her hands though the battle was over. She saw their faces, tired, scarred, but no longer bowed. Hope had been paid for in blood, and it flickered now in their eyes like the first flame on kindling. Yet even as she saw it, she knew the cost. Too many were gone. Too many names would never again be called at supper tables. Too many chairs would sit empty. Freedom had come, but it had demanded its tithe. She staggered toward the steps of the saloon, sinking down onto the bottom one, the rifle resting across her knees. Her breath came hard, shallow, her arm throbbing with pain. She pressed her hand to the wound, the warmth of her own blood seeping through her fingers. But she felt no fear, no weakness, only the strange quiet that comes after storms. Whispers rose around her. The townsfolk, drawn closer, stood in clusters, their voices hushed but insistent. They spoke her name now with awe, with disbelief, with reverence. Sarah Calder, the widow who had stood alone, had struck down the man who ruled them all. They wanted to know how, why, what strength had carried her where none dared tread. It was then, as the sun broke fully over the horizon, that the truth slipped free. She lifted her eyes, and for the first time she spoke not as a woman haunted by grief, but as one carrying the weight of truth. Her husband had not been a simple cattleman, as most believed. He had been the sheriff once, a man who dared to challenge Crow when others cowered. The badge he wore had been pried from his chest when they buried him. And Sarah, quiet, steadfast Sarah, had been his partner in more ways than one. She had stood at his side in every skirmish, had trained with his guns, had carried his secrets. When Crow killed him, he thought he had destroyed the law, but in truth, he had only forged its last weapon. Her eyes swept the crowd, her voice low but steady. He taught me to fight, because he knew the day might come when he would fall. He told me this land was worth bleeding for, and he told me never to forget that even the weakest among us has fire enough to burn the dark away. She paused, her throat tightening. He's gone, but tonight he rode with me, and with all of you. Silence held them, heavy and sacred. Then slowly, heads bowed, not in submission, not in fear, but in respect. The town that had once pitied her now stood before her with reverence in their eyes, their chains fallen at last. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the ruins. Smoke drifted upward, pale against the brilliance of the sky. Children ventured out into the street, chasing one another around broken barrels, their laughter hesitant at first, then stronger, truer. It was the first sound of joy the town had heard in years, and it carried through the air like music. Sarah rose, every muscle aching, her wound stiffening with dried blood. She looked to the horizon, where the desert stretched endless and unforgiving. She knew more trials would come. The West was never kind, never gentle. Bandits would rise again, storms would sweep through, lives would be lost. But the spell of Crow's rule had been broken, and the people had remembered their strength. That, she thought, was enough. The preacher's widow came to her, laying a hand on her shoulder. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. Sarah looked out at the dawn. Her husband's grave lay beyond the crooked oak, waiting. She would visit it again, lay her rifle there for a time, and whisper the truth of what had been done. But the West had a way of calling those who bore its scars, and she knew she would not rest long. Somewhere out there, others lived under the weight of men like Crow. Somewhere, justice waited to be carried once more in steady hands. She did not answer the widow, only tightened her grip on the rifle. The silence was answer enough. And so it was said, in the land where bandits once ruled, a widow stood alone when no one else would, and from her defiance grew freedom. Her name passed from lip to lip, from campfire to saloon, from whispered tale to written word, until she was no longer just Sarah Calder, but a legend. They said the West belonged to the bandits, until one day it didn't. And when the tale was told in the hush of night, when the wind carried voices across the desert like ghosts of memory, it always ended the same. Justice came with a gun.